Augustus Saint-Gaudens is known as a great artist, he's known as a great cultural leader, but in his art, he reached a pinnacle that had not been reached by others of his generation. He was able to have modernity and classicism in one piece.
There is flesh and blood beneath the surface of the stone or beneath the surface of the bronze. And you can look into their eyes, look away, and look back at them. And there are very few sculptors that can do that.
There are in Saint-Gaudens' sculptures an object that sets up a relationship with the viewer and in a sense makes the transition from the human world to the artificial world. It's an extraordinary gift.
I think of pathbreaker, innovator, mentor, role model, teacher, genius. He brought American sculpture together and made it come of age.
October 22nd, 1887, Lincoln Park, Chicago. The city is feeling the effects of a cold autumn wind as a crowd estimated at almost 10,000 strong gather under overcast skies to witness the unveiling of a monument to their fallen hero, Abraham Lincoln. The crowd is strangely quiet and stays close to keep out the cold as a sense of anticipation fills the air. The great American sculptor, Augustus Saint-Gaudens, sits nervously on the dais as he waits for his creation to be revealed to the world for the first time. After a few short speeches, the statue is unveiled, and a 38-gun salute breaks the calm. As people move in and surround the giant figure of Lincoln, who stands in front of a large chair, the moment is not lost on the sculptor. He feels a sense of relief. After 3 years of intense work, his childhood hero has been brought back to life for all the world to see. There will be many more, but this one is special. One critic wrote that it must have been a labor of love on the part of the sculptor. Another said, the statue proved that classic drapery is not indispensable to artistic effect, to make the human form seem somewhat divine.
On that rainy, dreary Saturday afternoon in Chicago, there's 10,000 people, there's cannons going, there's booming, there's sound, all kinds of things. A crowd raises its roar because the man from Illinois has been resurrected.
Saint-Gaudens is one of the key artists who gives us the modern image of Lincoln, and he does it really with that work. There was this need to present to Americans an image of Lincoln that was both heroic and real. That's the nerve that Saint-Gaudens struck in these monuments. He's got the essence of Lincoln, the public Lincoln and the private Lincoln.
What Saint-Gaudens creates is a first, if you will, memorial setting, a place in a park where you literally will come to visit and participate in. It is probably 100 feet from the road, so you have to walk down a path, so you are beginning, if you will, a processional. You are entering a creative shrine, a public space.
What I think is remarkable about the standing Lincoln is the whole environment that he did. You see Lincoln standing up from his chair, getting ready to speak. Behind Lincoln, you have this large exedra bench that invites the visitor, invites the viewer to sit behind Lincoln. Here, St. Gaudens wants the engagement of the visitor, not only to look at it and understand what you're saying, but to participate in it, become part of the monument. No one was doing that in America.
Though the face of Lincoln was based on a life mask, it was one that St. Gaudens knew well. As a young boy in New York, he had seen it for the first time when the president-to-be gave a campaign speech at Cooper Union, and once again when he lay in state after his death. Seeing the great leader lying before him had moved him so much that he came back again for a second look. It would stay with him throughout his life. Augustus was born in Dublin, Ireland, to Bernard Saint-Gaudens, a French shoemaker, and Mary McGuinness, a local seamstress. The family sailed to America to escape the potato famine in 1848.
They came in the steerage. They were not wealthy, so they came third class. They settled in a poor immigrant area of the city in the southern part of Manhattan. Bernard set up a shoe shop, and his wife was raising the boys. There were three of them. There was Augustus, there was Louis, and there was Andrew. I think St. Gaudens had a kind of a Horatio Alger beginning. He speaks in his reminiscences about wandering the streets, getting into trouble, kind of a typical urban upbringing for a boy of his time and his class. And the shoe business eventually prospered. Augustus, or Gus as his parents called him, said he didn't care what he did as long as he could use his hands. He wanted to make something or create something. So the father used his connections in the French society and found a cameo cutter, a man named Louis Ave, who needed an apprentice, and Augustus was put to work there. It's interesting because that's where the family and Gus himself first realized that he had a talent with art, because he made cameos that are still considered to be some of the most beautiful cameos ever made. And he made them completely untrained, completely just off the cuff, just as a young boy coming in and sitting down, being told how to do it, he just did it.
I think that some of those cameos are quite magnificent. They're very small, they're pieces of jewelry, they're made out of stone and shell, but they're really portraits in relief. They're extremely difficult to make.
Some of his early cameos really come across like a trumpet of ambition. You know, look at me, I am very technically skilled. I think he challenged the masters that he worked for, but we just know that he was all about ambition and really had a fire to become an artist.
From his window in Ave's small studio, Gus watched the Civil War go by. He would later write, "From my window, I saw virtually the entire contingent of New England volunteers on their way to the Civil War, a spectacle profoundly impressive even to my youthful imagination." The draft riots would soon follow. Life in America would never be the same.
At the same time, he had grander ambitions and began studying at the Cooper Union, which was a very popular place to study because it was free, for one, and it was flexible, so he could work during the day and study at night. He then entered the National Academy of Design, which again was a very traditional academic route. But what he got there was exposure to major American artists of the day, like John Quincy Adams Ward.
St. Gaudens took all kinds of art lessons, not knowing what he was going to do, but he took to sculpture. Ward was an established sculptor, and at that point, the father had a surprise for him. He and his wife had gathered up enough funds to send him to Europe. And not only that, but because of the father's French background, he could go to the French art school, the École des Beaux-Arts. So St. Gaudens was sent to Paris in 1867 with $100 in his pocket.
The turning point was when he went to Paris in 1867, and he had the support of his family, in a sense, to go back to roots that he had never explored. And when he got to Paris, he had a real leg up on other Americans there because he spoke French. So he made friendships with French artists to a degree that most Americans never could have dreamed of doing, and that really was to his advantage. He definitely struggled. There are the stories of him sleeping on the floor in the studio of a friend. He carved cameos to supplement his income.
And of course, what was offered in Paris were the ateliers of many of France's greatest artists and architects. And this whole period in the mid-19th century is when you have the rise, in effect, of professionalism, the professional art, so to speak.
What was notable at the time was that he chose to go to Paris and not to Rome or Florence, where previous Americans had gone to study neoclassical sculptors. And that really was the crux of what changed the course of American sculpture.
When he entered the École, he entered a program that was based on competency in modeling, drawing, painting the human form. So his classes were in drawing from life, drawing from the antique, everything geared towards drawing the human form correctly. What we call the Beaux-Arts style of sculpture is a naturalistic emphasis on the form. This was an acknowledgement that realism was okay, lumps and warts and all.
Unlike New York, Paris had major art museums like the Louvre, where Gus discovered everything from the classical to contemporary French works of art. But it was at the Paris Exposition of 1867, the first French World's Fair, that he saw something that would change his life forever. He saw a sculpture by the renowned French artist François Geoffroy, titled Girl Confiding Her Secret to Venus.
Unlike anything he had seen in New York, this was a piece which combined a really intense realism with a kind of a natural grace and a kind of an emotional quality which he had not seen in any art in America. Geoffroy was an innovative artist. He was doing something that other French artists were not doing. He was a member of what was called the Neo-Florentines. It was a group of artists seeing as their inspiration not classicism, not Greece and Rome, but Renaissance Italy. And that was really important to Saint-Gaudens because by being shifted into that group, right from the very beginning, it set the course for his career.
In 1870, the French Emperor Napoleon III was pushed into a disastrous war with Prussia. With the enemy forces occupying Paris, Saint-Gaudens caught one of the last trains to southern France and eventually landed in Rome.
As he said, he walked out into the city the first morning, saw the classical ruins, saw the sun glistening off the marble, and he said it was like a door was opened to the world of the classical.
When Gus was in Rome, he had his own studio. He was part of a community of artists with studios where those on the grand tour came to call to see the work and sometimes to commission work. The wealthy would come and call at an open studio afternoon, and you would show them your work, and you would have tea with them, and you would walk in the gardens with them, and you courted the family and you courted the children so that everyone felt comfortable sitting for a portrait bust. And that was a tough set of learning experiences for Gus. He didn't come by that naturally.
One of Saint-Gaudens' first clients was William Evarts, a distinguished lawyer and statesman who sat for a portrait bust.
I think the Evarts is his strongest early portrait. It is uncompromising in the realism, just a beautifully carved marble. And Evarts was one of his most important early supporters, from agreeing to sit for the portrait to recommending Saint-Gaudens to his friends.
Saint-Gaudens' first major commission would come from American businessman Montgomery Gibbs. It was a portrait of the great American Indian chief, Hiawatha.
The Hiawatha was a work that Saint-Gaudens said would open people's eyes, and it would astonish the world. And to me, those remarks speak of an enormous ambition on his part.
Saint-Gaudens chose to portray Hiawatha in a defeated pose. It's a very still piece, it's a very compact piece in a way. It's not all about the Beaux-Arts surface bravura that he would have seen in Paris. It's a very traditional composition.
It's American in subject matter, but if you look at the piece, it's very Michelangelesque in terms of form. And I think it was self-referential about being an American, choosing a subject matter that would call attention to what was a little bit different from subject matter in Rome. He wanted to really set the world spinning and have the world know who he was. He had tremendous talent, dexterity, gifts that he wanted the world to know about.
The life in Rome was not all work. There were parties, there were places to explore, and they were rather stuffy parties, but St. Gaudens was invited to them and he went. And at one of these Christmas parties, his eye was caught by a young girl who was standing in a corner. She didn't seem to be mingling with the others. And he went over to greet her, and it was a young American named Augusta Homer.
Gus would later write to a friend, "She was slim and quite tall and held herself beautifully. Her hair was piled high in a pompadour-like effect. The eyes were extraordinary, a blue that seemed sometimes to go almost black."
She had been sent to Rome by her parents to learn art. She was a painter, he was a sculptor. They were both from America. They were both the same age. And they hit it off. And sure enough, at one point, St. Gaudens contacted Thomas Homer, the father, and said, "I'd like your daughter's hand in marriage." And Homer was caught. On the one hand, his social pretensions said, "This boy is the son of immigrants. They don't have money. I don't know if this is the right match for my daughter." So he made one caveat. "You get one job, one important job, and you can have my daughter."
And that important job would come in the form of a commission to create a monument honoring the Civil War hero, Admiral David Farragut.
The Civil War is really a catalyst that brings American sculpture into the common parlance that we know of today. It brings it out into the real world. So you begin to have monuments, works that are set up in squares, in parks, to be seen and to be viewed and to be experienced in the elements. It's into that arena that you then find Augustus Saint-Gaudens coming back to the United States and gets the commission for the Farragut.
Admiral David Glasgow Farragut was one of the great heroes of the Civil War, and he was responsible for the subduing of the Confederate fleet outside of New Orleans and the famous remark, "Damn the torpedoes, full steam ahead."
The commission for the Farragut Monument would not come easily. At first, the committee awarded the monument to John Quincy Adams Ward, Gus's former teacher. But Ward was overwhelmed with work and instead suggested they give it to St. Gaudens, an artist with great promise. It was the break that Gus had waited for. He said, "I have such respect and admiration for the heroes of the Civil War that I consider it my duty to help in any way to commemorate them in noble and dignified fashion." And with that, he married Augusta and plunged himself into his work.
Because he recognized this piece was so important to his career, I think he decided early on it was going to be something special and different and new and unique. And in every way he approached it, he was thinking outside the box.
The Farragut Monument is not only St. Gaudens' first important commission, but it's also an important keynote in American art. It was to be in Madison Park, which was in that time one of the central parts of Manhattan.
The Farragut is really a pioneering work for two reasons. First, it is the manner in which St. Gaudens has chosen to portray the figure of Farragut. You almost see the wind blowing, you feel the ocean spray, and then he gently folds over the left corner of the coat as if it's being windblown. Secondly, he introduces two allegorical relief figures. So not only do you have the biography of the man, but you have these symbolic works of art. And that precedent of including allegory in a monument comes directly from France.
When it was unveiled in May of 1881, the Farragut was a turning point for American sculpture. It was intended to celebrate a great American hero, but also to teach Americans about the kind of values that should come across in a monument.
These sea figures, the mythological figures, seem to emerge out of the stone itself with real flesh. The lettering on that monument, on that pedestal, is some of the most beautiful I've ever seen, in the sense that Saint-Gaudens understood how light would play across incised or raised figures. And during the course of the day, the inscription is, on the one hand, legible. It says something. On the other hand, there are passages that almost look like pure abstraction in their play of light and shadow, of figure and ground.
In this horizontal pedestal, he includes a bench. And what the bench is doing is inviting people to come and sit. And once you invite them to come and sit, you are in a sense drawing them into the memorial, because they have to participate.
The critics raved about the piece. They recognized that Saint-Gaudens had great talent. And this was the point where they really got on the Saint-Gaudens bandwagon and acknowledged that Saint-Gaudens was going to be this exemplar for the new school of American sculpture.
With the Farragut, Saint-Gaudens said he was trying to strike away from the stuff we have in America. Yes, he had a figure, a Civil War figure, on a pedestal, but on a wildly different pedestal from anything that had been seen before, and that was the gift of his friendship and collaboration with the architect Stanford White, who designed the pedestal.
When he had his arrangement with Stanford White, what was so drastically different was that they lived and worked together, that they shared the solution. This is not White's design or Gus's design, it's a joint design.
And I think both men realized that they were making a contribution. And that is, in essence, what greatness of American public memorials and monuments is, the collaborative effort of sculptors and architects.
I think one of the extraordinary things to understand about American sculpture is that in a very brief amount of time, we went from being stone cutters and wood carvers, essentially not fine artists, to maybe in 50 years had a real medium of sculpture. It's quite an achievement in this young country.
The Farragut didn't change Gus immediately, but it brought commissions to his door, and it made him one of the new leaders of the new art. And what follows very quickly is the commission for the Deacon Chapin Monument. We know that as the Puritan.
There was something else that was different about this new art in public sculpture. It was the use of bronze as the medium of choice.
So much can be done with the bronze surface and the finishing of the metal and the chasing and hammering and refining, and then of course in the coloring of the bronze surface, the modulation of the tones to bring out the character of the sculpture. In a way, it helps impart the message that the sculptor or the client wants to put forth.
Any young artist has to get jobs, and as a young man, Saint-Gaudens, like all struggling artists, took whatever he could find. He worked with John Lafarge at Trinity Church in Boston, painting murals, but he also was introduced to Cornelius Vanderbilt III in New York. Saint-Gaudens designed a fireplace, a clock, and other figures there. Once Saint-Gaudens became established in art, and once he became able to have his own studio, he was able to actually go out and find the jobs himself. And he would do that by joining clubs. Stanford White introduced him to a number of the main social clubs in New York, the Century, the Players, where he would meet not only industrialists, but other artists. His love was sculpture, and he would try to get whatever work he could. Then as now, the way you find that is by basically pounding the pavement. You go out and look.
One of St. Gaudens' most successful sources of income was creating portrait reliefs for his wealthy patrons. It was something he had begun in Europe and quickly mastered.
A relief is not a three-dimensional sculpture. It has a single primary perspective. It is, in a way, the bridge between sculpture and painting. St. Gaudens was told by his friend John Lafarge to think of sculpting bas-reliefs as painting a sculpture, and that's really the technique that he pursued in these incredible low-relief sculptures.
The relief comes gradually out of the background. St. Gaudens was able to model reliefs in very, very low relief, more so than anybody else. I believe because he had been so extensively involved with cameos.
For St. Gaudens, sculpture was all about projecting character, and his most successful works are those that put forth the essence of the sitter. And this is certainly true in his great relief portraits as well, whether it's a portrait of the innocence of childhood or a sick Robert Louis Stevenson. St. Gaudens was the consummate perfectionist, whether in a monument or in a bas-relief commission, and he did not stop until he was satisfied and got it right.
Mark Twain labeled it the Gilded Age. In the years since the Civil War, America had experienced unprecedented economic growth. And while it did not always trickle down to the thousands of new immigrants that poured onto her shores every day, it was a good time to be an artist. Since working with St. Gaudens on the Farragut Monument, Stanford White had become a prominent architect, building colossal mansions for a new breed of wealthy patrons with the firm McKim, Mead, and White. At the same time, St. Gaudens quickly learned how to mingle with the rich and the famous in order to obtain commissions. Together, they carved out a good lifestyle and enjoyed the pleasures that come with success.
In the Gilded Age, there was enormous wealth that was made in America, so people were building new mansions and residences all over the eastern seaboard, and then they had to decorate them, so they had enormous space for paintings and sculpture.
It's a world where there's an explosion of money after the Civil War. New York and Chicago are exploding, the trains are changing the way people travel, and the world begins to become smaller. It's a world where art is in the forefront of the great things that are happening. Buildings are being built. There are grand vistas and major public monuments being built. The major cities around the country are seeing that their responsibility to themselves and to their communities is to have great architecture and great art and great artists.
She was named the Huntress Diana, but everyone referred to her simply as Diana. Placed on top of the largest pedestal ever to hold up a statue, Stanford White's Madison Square Garden, she was as controversial as she was beautiful.
Diana was St. Gaudens' only nude female sculpture, and she was absolutely one of the most beautiful things to see in New York at the time. She was lit up at night, and she rotated, and you would have the lights bouncing off her gilded surface in the evening and at night, and then in the day with the sun hitting that golden surface. It just was riveting.
Then as now, nudity was a tremendously controversial issue, and it was said that proper New Yorkers felt very uncomfortable about seeing this nude figure on the top of Madison Square Garden, and the fact that it was gilded and blazed in the sunlight and was incandescently lit at night, and it made a lot of people feel very uncomfortable and earned a lot of critical censure. But on the other hand, it is one of Saint-Gaudens' most iconic pieces now and was one of his most popular commercial works.
It's obviously a classical figure, mythological figure, Diana the Huntress. But I also like to think of it as a great classical American weather vane. It was meant to turn. Here again, Saint-Gaudens' exploitation of the silhouette, something that he goes back, maybe not in a conscious way, but to that craft tradition, that American folk tradition of not Dianas, but cows and Indians turning on barn roofs. Here, Saint-Gaudens has taken that American idea and translated it into an urban, literally modern setting.
The original Diana was 18 feet tall, and it quickly became apparent that it was too big for the building. So Saint-Gaudens created a more refined 13-foot version that is the icon that we know today. For Saint-Gaudens, the Diana was more than just a professional success. It was also very personal. The model for the face was a Swedish woman by the name of Devita Clark, and he would eventually fall in love with her. It was no secret that Stanford White and Saint-Gaudens enjoyed the company of women, and there were a number of affairs during their outings in New York. But this one did not end. There was something about her that captivated him, and he would use her likeness in other works, including the Amor Caritas.
She had very beautiful classical features, but he was also drawn to her as a person, and eventually they would form a friendship which would lead to an intimacy and eventually the birth of a child.
In the spring of 1885, Saint-Gaudens, his wife Augusta, and their young son Homer took the train to Cornish, New Hampshire, a farming community located at the foot of Mount Ascutney and nestled along the banks of the Connecticut River. Augusta desperately wanted to escape the frantic life of the city, and a good friend of theirs, Charles Beeman, suggested that they rent an old inn that he owned. It was not far from the river and had an excellent view of the mountain. Saint-Gaudens wrote, "To persuade me to come, Mr. Beeman had said that there were plenty of Lincoln-shaped men up there. He was right. So during the summer of my arrival, I made my first sketch for the standing Lincoln. I was so enchanted with the life and the scenery, I thought what a joy it is to come to the country." Saint-Gaudens' brother, Louis, his studio assistant, and a fine artist in his own right, soon joined them, and it wasn't long before the word spread and many other artists and friends began spending their summers in the area as well. It would become known as the Cornish colony.
He named the property Aspet. Aspet was where his father came from in the Pyrenees in southern France. Said, all right, I'll name this after my father's birthplace. It's a beautiful area, mountainous area, pine forests. There was the Connecticut River and this huge mountain coming up behind it, Mount Ascutney. Very different from anything that Saint-Gaudens had seen. The Cornish colony began as a group of artists who were all friends of Saint-Gaudens. Some of them came with him when he first came. Some of them came because he was here. It was not really set up as a school or as a formal entity. They were his friends. They were artists. They were painters, sculptors, later performing artists, actors, actresses. They were the members of what was known as the American Renaissance. It's interesting, in the 19th century, we think of these artists as rather formal, even stuffy kind of people, but when you see the accounts, they weren't at all.
For Augusta, life in the country had begun with such promise. But as each summer passed and the Cornish colony grew, she realized the New York social scene that she sought to escape had instead come with them. She was also gradually going deaf and became more and more reclusive and less popular. Stanford White said, "Why fate should have ordained that such a man should be harnessed to such a woman, heaven only knows." But it was St. Gaudens himself who realized the importance of Augusta in his life. He wrote to her from one of his frequent trips, "You are a noble woman, Gussie, and I love and respect you more than you have conception of. For our mutual peace of mind on this earth, I beg of you not to come down from the high place I hold you in my heart." St. Gaudens was deeply affected by the passing of his mother Mary, but was proud to show off his son Homer to grandfather Bernard. And as each summer passed, they would make improvements to Aspet until it finally felt like home. Visitors would arrive from far and wide to spend time with the master artist, who loved to play the flute while his wife played the piano. And when they had made the house all their own, Charles Beeman finally gave in and sold it to them. As much as he enjoyed the country, St. Gaudens was driven by his work. By the mid-1880s, he had clearly established himself as the master of American sculpture. Daniel Chester French had become well known for his Minuteman in Concord, Massachusetts, but even he would admit that St. Gaudens was the sculptor of choice. New commissions came in all the time, and it took a small army of assistants to help him complete his work.
Once he became established, St. Gaudens broke off into a direction that other people were not doing. What he realized very early on was that if he brought other people in to work with him, assistants, he could take more commissions, do more jobs. So he set up a business of sculpture. Critics called it a corporate style of art. But in the 19th century, that was not a bad thing. And he then established studios in Paris and in New York, and eventually in Cornish, New Hampshire. So at any given time, he could have 2 or 3 studios working. So he could basically take any commission that came along.
St. Gaudens was a man of thought. He was a man of idea. And he didn't have to execute the piece himself. He didn't have to be the one to put every line down and scrape away every slip of clay. He, through his criticism and his observation, could project his personality through other people. And when you read the reminiscences of his students, Fraser for one, Frances Grimes, she said that she really felt as if she was doing his bidding. I mean, it was almost this strange sort of, shall we say, Svengali-like relationship that he had with his students, where he could direct them. It's almost like something from the Twilight Zone, how he could do it, and do it not only so forcefully, but so successfully. Today, you can look at a photograph which can capture a flicker of time and occasionally catch the personality of a person. But St. Gaudens was able to do that with his hands, with clay, and then change the clay into plaster and turn the plaster into bronze, and still manage to capture that humanity, that personality, whether it be serene or whether it be mad. And I don't know how he did it.
To create a figure in proportion that looks like a human being is not that difficult. You know, to create a figure that looks like it's going to reach out and grab you around the neck, that takes talent. And I think that that's what all the great sculptors have, and that's what fuels them. Look at any of St. Gaudens' work, any of his character studies. The Sherman. Just to look at the bust of the Sherman, and I'm not so sure you would ever choose to have coffee with that guy. That's the magic of it.
St. Gaudens must have understood that Sherman felt that in order to finish the war, he had to break the South. So you have this dilemma of how to achieve a shortening of the war by the most devastating means. I think St. Gaudens really captured that. There is a determination, but there's also a great tragic sense in it. And he's almost being carried beyond his own self off into war by the victory figure, but just that forward movement. It's almost as if everything is out of his control, even though he was very much a man who was in control.
St. Gaudens moved to Paris in 1897 to work on the Sherman and to really devote himself to modeling what would be his great equestrian. And in that, he combines the real and the ideal. The General Sherman moving forward on his horse with the wind-blown tail, and the allegorical figure of victory leading him forward into battle.
There are very few equestrian groups in American sculpture where the horse is shown in motion, but the composition is anchored. And what is interesting is that the illusion is made real because on most equestrian statues, the horse's hooves are anchored onto a bronze self-base. In the case of the Sherman, they are literally held into the granite. So he's not walking on an illusionary ground. He's walking on real ground, which is stone. And in this one particular moment, horse, rider, and allegorical figure are a unit. And that's St. Gaudens' genius.
The final Sherman Memorial in Central Park is truly a three-dimensional object in space. Nonetheless, there is a sense that there is a principal point of view, and it is the silhouette of the horse and figure seen from the side. That's where it's most legible, it's most clear. A sense of outline, that clarity of form seen against a stage. It was a kind of genius that I think runs throughout all of his work.
All of St. Gaudens' works become icons. Even to this day, people can see St. Gaudens for the first time and they're drawn to it. It reaches out to people, it speaks to people in a way which other art does not.
It was officially called the World's Columbian Exposition, but to everyone who attended, it was the 1893 Chicago World's Fair, and it took the country by storm. At the time, America was riding the crest of a major growth spurt that would bring it into the world arena in almost every major form of human endeavor. The fair was a chance to show the world how far we had come.
One of the things that the Chicago World's Fair did was to really bring American art to the world. And that was important because by 1893, America no longer had to be ashamed of its culture. It was really a prominent leader in the cultural world.
The World's Columbian Exposition is amazingly important for America and America's view of itself. And they invite their best architects and artists to build temporary buildings. And they decorate them in the taste of the day, classical, Renaissance revival, beautiful, with massive pieces of sculpture. Inside the fair proper, the buildings are full of the great inventions and wonders of the moment. It allows America to see itself as a great city of the world, and it gives America an idea of what a grand city might look like.
The architects wanted one person to come, not to create any sculpture, not to lift any tool, but just for his eye and for his ability to give counsel and advice, and that was Augustus Saint-Gaudens.
He worked on the Planning Commission with Daniel Burnham. He famously said, "This is the greatest meeting of artists since the 15th century," and I think he took a lot of pride in the fact that America could come together with this great group of artists and produce a fair that was worthy of international attention and respect. In 1888, Saint-Gaudens began teaching at the Art Students League, and teaching and mentoring was critical to him. He had a studio full of assistants who he took pride in mentoring and bringing along as artists in a very public way. So he gained commissions for Frederick McMonnies, for the Barge of State, the great Columbian fountain in the center of the lagoon, and also Daniel Chester French with his over life-size figure of Republic. The fair was just chock-a-block full of public sculpture decorating the lagoons and the bridges and the buildings, and he was represented by his Diana, which was on top of the agriculture building.
In the 1893 fair, public sculpture is as much a part of the city fabric as architecture, great architecture was. It doesn't last, but at that moment in time, it wasn't just a building that mattered. It was the building, the way the building was set into the space with respect to other buildings. It was the sculpture, it was the landscaping that gave a city gravitas and presence.
The Shaw Memorial is the greatest public sculpture of America's greatest period of public sculpture. That is the period of the City Beautiful movement in the late 19th century. That begins with the World's Columbian Exposition in Chicago in '93. Sculpture is basically act. It's a body in space. Our architecture is primarily environment. It makes a space. Human beings make an environment for themselves, and they act in it, and they embody their acts in sculpture. Saint-Gaudens gave so many people a sense that the city was an important thing, that it was a noble thing, and that America had a noble past.
I think the Shaw Memorial is a very moving experience when you first see it. And what I always notice first are the black soldiers who are leaning forward slightly as they march south out of Boston, heading to destiny. And what moves me is this look of determination on their face. They're leaning into the future. Once a black man put on that blue uniform with the gold buttons and U.S. and carrying a rifle, a weapon, and performing a mission for the nation, then ultimately no power on the earth can persuade that individual that he is not the equal to his white brother. And there in the middle of it, on a horse, sitting up tall, is Colonel Shaw.
In many ways, Colonel Robert Gould Shaw was just another one of the tens of thousands of young men doomed to die fighting for the Union Army during the Civil War. But his fate took a different direction when he was commissioned to lead the 54th Regiment of Massachusetts, the first all-African-American volunteer unit to fight in the war. While Shaw himself was white, he was determined to show the world that African American troops could be the equal of their counterparts. He fought for equal pay and proper uniforms, and proudly led them off to war from the foot of the State House on Boston Common, in front of hundreds of onlookers. Poet John Whittier remarked, "I can never forget the scene as Colonel Shaw rode at the head of his men. The very flower of grace and chivalry, he seemed to me beautiful and awful, as an angel of God come down to lead the host of freedom to victory." The 54th Regiment finally got their chance to fight in South Carolina. After a brief battle in which they fought bravely, they marched to Fort Wagner, a Confederate stronghold on the coast.
And on that fateful day, they marched down the beach. And in the tradition of military tactics of the time, they massed themselves and walked right into that fire. And as the story is told, they started to break, which is not unheard of when you're facing that kind of direct fire coming at you. And it was Colonel Shaw who stood up and said, "Keep going, lads, keep going. This is not the time to break." And they didn't. And they continued into the withering fire, into the trenches and over the top, where they met their fate.
Shaw was one of the first to die as he led his men over the top of the parapet. More than half the regiment was either killed or wounded that day. A Confederate lieutenant later said, "The Negroes fought gallantly and were headed by as brave a colonel as ever lived." "20 years after the death of Colonel Shaw, St. Gaudens was commissioned to create a memorial honoring the fallen hero. At first, he had decided to make a lone equestrian figure, but when Shaw's family requested that he include the troops, he became totally consumed by the monument. St. Gaudens later wrote, "I increased the conception until the rider grew almost to a statue in the round, and the Negroes assumed far more importance than I had originally intended. The monument had become a labor of love." In his obsession to make the monument as realistic as possible, he modeled 40 different men for the heads of the soldiers. As the size and scope of the project increased, deadlines for its completion came and went. The head of the Shaw Memorial Committee wrote, "People are grumbling for it, the city is howling for it, and most of the committee has become toothless waiting for it." St. Gaudens said, "It's the way a thing's done that makes it right or wrong. That's the only creed I have in art. After all, statues are plastered up before the world for centuries, while men and nations pass away." The Shaw Memorial was unveiled on May 31st, 1897, 13 years after St. Gaudens began work on it. He sat silently on the review stand while Augusta took photos of the retired members of the Massachusetts 54th, marching in tribute to their fallen comrades. One critic called it a symphony in bronze.
Shaw frightens me and moves me. My heart breaks for those troops. Oh, those wonderful faces, the old man, the boys, oh my goodness. And you feel they are dedicated to death. And they're choosing it. They're choosing it. And so you feel awe. I mean, I think you're lifted out of yourself and you're awed and you wonder about human life. You wonder how people have this power, how they have this strength, how they had this determination. How they could focus like that, how they could do that, how they could walk up to that rampart where they didn't have a chance. Amazing.
Making public sculpture is one thing. Making a work of art is another thing. Saint-Gaudens was struggling over a part of the memorial, that is the floating angel above the soldiers. But what is remarkable is how he takes that, if you will, snapshot of real life and makes it a monument by introducing the allegorical figure. So he takes it out of the moment and puts it into the ethereal.
The art historian Vincent Scully wrote, "Saint-Gaudens sets these people here as only a great sculptor can do, populating our world with living bodies, filling it with their will to act, their resolve, marching down Beacon Street just as they in fact marched off to the war, to the eternal glory of them all." By the late 1890s, with the unveiling of the monument to Peter Cooper at Cooper Union in New York and the Logan Monument in Chicago, Saint-Gaudens was heralded as America's greatest sculptor and one of its greatest artists. But he still had some unfinished business. He wanted to show Europe and the world what he had accomplished. So he displayed plaster originals of his most important works at the Paris Exposition of 1900. It was the dawn of a new century.
It was not the first World's Fair in Paris, and it wouldn't be the last, but it was an important one. Saint-Gaudens wanted to show the Sherman Memorial, which he was just developing, and the Shaw Memorial as well. The Shaw Memorial was, and still is, his most powerful and evocative piece, and it's the piece that caused the most stir there. So much so that Augustus Saint-Gaudens, who was the head of the art commission for the fair, stopped in front of the Shaw and made a show of removing his hat and bowing to it. He didn't do that to anyone else's work.
That's really what Saint-Gaudens needed. He needed to know he was wonderful, that he was the equal of the great sculptors of his age on the European stage, where he had been trained, where the great artists were being trained.
For Saint-Gaudens, the exposition could not have gone better. The French government purchased the Amor Caritas, and he was showered with awards highlighted by the Grand Prize and the French Legion of Honor. In a letter to a friend, he wrote, "This Paris experience has been a great thing for me. All blindness seems to have been washed away. I see my place clearly now. I think I know just where I stand." He was at the pinnacle of his career, and he knew it. In 1900, Augustus Saint-Gaudens returned to America and his beloved Aspet. "The older I grow," he said as he approached 60, "the more my youth seems good to remember. But I don't regret much the march of the years, and I have found new strength in the air at daybreak." But just before he left Paris, he had been told that he had intestinal cancer. Saint-Gaudens was devastated. He wrote to a friend, "Since the diagnosis, there has not been a day in my life when a horrible vision of death has not been constantly hanging over me. But about 3 months ago, the vision of death vanished, and an entire new grip on life and health took possession of me. It was so extraordinary that I seized on it as a drowning man seizes on a rock." Living at Aspet year-round, he was determined to live his life to the fullest. He structured his day around health food, exercise, and work. He built a toboggan run, played ice hockey, and went for long walks. He found comfort in Cornish colony friends like painter Maxfield Parrish, poet Percy Mackay, and many others. But as always, Saint-Gaudens was driven by his work. He built a larger studio to house his bigger projects, and woke early each morning to pen notes instructing his assistants. Augusta spent her time attending to business affairs, and business was good. As time pressed in, he would direct the work from a chair, or when the pain was too great, he would sit on the porch, scribbling down thoughts with his customary caricatures. No longer able to do much traveling, he rarely saw his longtime lover, Davida, and their son, Novi, who would later destroy all of their letters. As he grew weaker and weaker, St. Gaudens decided to concentrate on one final project that he knew would have lasting significance. President Teddy Roosevelt asked him to redesign the nation's gold coins.
It was Roosevelt's aim to make America a world power. He realized that if he had wonderful coins, it would be a mark of the power of the country as well.
Roosevelt pushed the idea onto Gus, who was in 1905 terribly ill. And I think Gus, somewhere deep inside, must have felt that this was a chance at immortality that was otherwise not reachable. He was actually commissioned to create all four denominations, which would be a $20, $10, $5, and $2.50 gold piece.
And both the president and St. Gaudens saw the only place to go was back to the Greeks and the Romans. They wanted a classical origin for the coins.
He started with these wonderful lightning-quick pencil sketches, which he then translated into clay and plaster sketches. Finally, in February, the first four were made, and they were, in a word, astonishing. They were not just a coin. Liberty, with her hair whipping in the wind, her gown billowing in the breeze, and behind her, the rays of the sun explode. She is actually stepping out of the coin. Movement on a coin is almost unheard of.
The designs are so powerful and so important that even to this day, they're known as the most beautiful coins ever designed in America.
Roosevelt said in 1908, St. Gaudens gave us at last a coinage that was worthy of this country.
Only the $10 and $20 gold coins were ever minted, and St. Gaudens would never see them. As he faced his death, he must have reflected on one of his most unusual commissions. Clover Adams committed suicide in 1885. She had been the wife of the famous historian Henry Adams. Deeply distressed by her passing, he asked St. Gaudens to create a fitting memorial.
And the problem, of course, immediately was, how do you commemorate a suicide? It's been called a memorial, a portrait, a personification, an emblem of grief, of emotion. It's really about the mystery of the transition of life and death, and in a way, the inexplicability of both.
The fact that Adams suggested that St. Gaudens look at Buddhism, that he read some Eastern mysticism, that he look at the Sibyls and some of the figures that Michelangelo painted on the ceiling of the Sistine Chapel. I mean, it's universal. It reaches out in that kind of way, embodying the best of Western spirituality with the best of Eastern spirituality, and it fuses so nicely.
He wanted something that was itself but nothing else, and creates a quiet, still moment. When you go in there, you feel as though you've been given a new lease on life, which is a remarkable thing to say in a cemetery at somebody's grave.
I feel that it's a very uplifting space. I feel that it's a very thought-provoking space. It's a personal space. It's the space between you and St. Gaudens, or between you and St. Gaudens' creation. Now remember, Henry Adams wrote this in the third person, okay? And he's describing his reaction to the statue he commissions. Naturally, every detail interested him. Every line, every touch of the artist, every change of light and shade, every point of relation. He never once thought of questioning what it meant. The interest of the figure was not in its meaning, but in the response of the observer. Like all great artists, Saint-Gaudens held up the mirror and no more. What do you think the artist is trying to tell us? Let's talk about that before you write. Carl, what do you got?
I think that it's kind of like the Mona Lisa, where people try to figure out what it means and how they can connect to it. But I think it's more like a mirror for themselves, and they're trying to figure themselves out.
All right. Okay. Good.
When you look at its face and the closed eyes, it feels like at any second he or she will open their eyes and just walk away and accept what's coming for them.
Okay.
If God had a human form, I think this would be it.
If God had a human form,
if God had a human form, this would be it, because it's so universal and it's kind of mysterious at the same time. Because I would see him or her or it kind of just sitting there pondering, thinking everybody's thoughts, because it seems like it has a lot going on in his mind, and it's just sitting there meditating.
Okay.
They're thinking.
For me, it feels really calming. It's like a relaxation because the eyes are closed and the hand's not yet on the chin. And it just makes me feel, it doesn't make me feel content with my life, but it's kind of like a relaxation and a chance to see how I really feel about what's upcoming for me.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right. Let me ask, Sarah?
I kind of looked at it and saw it as a judge.
You saw it as a judge?
Yeah, it just seems really solemn and sober, and it looks so universal that I could see it as having been here since the beginning of time, and it'll stay there until the end.
So you see it as being somewhat timeless
Yeah.
in its universality. Okay. The German poet Rilke wrote a very short poem about don't look for the answers, live the question. And I think maybe part of what works for me is sort of, it's okay that there's a mystery out there. Where one might argue that perhaps, Civil War monuments aren't relevant today, I don't think you can say that with the Adams Memorial. It is incredibly relevant because it deals with that mystery, that thing that we wish we knew but don't know and can't know until we encounter it. That's, I think, the creative genius that Saint-Gaudens pulls off in that monument.
The statesman John Hay said of the Adams Memorial, "It is indescribably noble and imposing. It is full of poetry and suggestions, infinite wisdom, a past without beginning and a future without end. It is, to my mind, Saint-Gaudens' masterpiece." Homer observed that his father's sickness brought only feebleness of hand, not of the mind. To the last, his vision grew fuller and deeper. One day, while watching the sun set behind Mount Ascutney, Saint-Gaudens spoke out of a long silence. "It's very beautiful," he said, "but I want to go farther away." On a summer day in 1905, members of the Cornish colony began preparing for a special occasion to honor their ailing friend. Nearly 100 strong, they dressed as gods, goddesses, nymphs, and satyrs, and gathered in front of a Greek temple set up at the end of a long meadow near Aspet. Together they performed what would be known as a Mask of Hours. In the end, Saint-Gaudens and Augusta are led away on a chariot. It was a joyous occasion, and one that would be remembered for years after. Augustus Saint-Gaudens died on August 3, 1907, and was laid to rest here in the same meadow where the mask was performed. Years later, Homer Saint-Gaudens would write, "The best biography of my father remains to be found in his art. Strength and elegance, refinement of ideals, a single devotedness toward clarifying the sculpture of his land. All this he stamped into his bronze."
It really isn't until the late 20th century that we get public memorials again that strike deep into the American imagination. The fact that we've had nothing in between suggests how powerful St. Gaudens' sculpture has been.
What St. Gaudens created were monuments that created experience, made you think about what made a hero out of a man, made you think about what it had been like to be a general in the war. They were framed and orchestrated so that you had a specific experience. That's a very rare thing to do.
It could be a great sculpture, but if it doesn't project character, it's failed. And St. Gaudens knew that. He was very cognizant of the fact that these monuments would last a lot longer than he would, and that this was, in a sense, his living legacy to the American public.
He was able to mix a cool precision with emotion. He always kept a simplicity in his art. He was a man who could bring enormous complexity and make it accessible to the common man. There's no one else that's quite like him.
The mark of any good artist is the ability to get people to see not the first time, but the 10th time. There are statues of St. Gaudens that I've seen 100 times, and I don't grow tired of them.
When I look at a statue by St. Gaudens, I am struck by not only its power, but its grace and its depth of being. It is more than life captured in bronze, and it is timeless, and the mark of genius.
St. Gaudens once said, "I suppose every effort toward great sincerity or honesty or beauty in one's production is a drop added to the ocean of evolution, to the something higher that I suppose we are rising slowly to. But whatever it is, the passage is terribly sad and tragic, and to bear up against what seems at times the great doom over us, love and courage are the great things."